Good afternoon. My name is Peter Achenstein. I'm a professor in the philosophy department at Hopkins. And today I'm going to talk to you on a topic that is of special interest to me. It's called Disregarding Evidence. And I've written a number of books and articles on the topic of evidence. And always thought it was the best thing you could get in science. I'm interested in the philosophy of science, and so I'm interested in the role evidence plays in the philosophy of in science. So several people asked me questions about this. They said, "Well, what happens when you don't have evidence?" You have no evidence at all, but you make up hypotheses. And so I thought about that. I wrote a book about that, and it was called Speculation. And indeed, scientists do occasionally, if not more than occasionally, do that sort of thing. But then someone raised much more recently the following question for me. What happens when you have some evidence for your claim, but you disregard other evidence? You don't take it into account when you consider how well supported your hypothesis is. In other words, what happens when you disregard evidence? And everybody says, at least in the scientific world, everybody says that's a no-no. That you never do that. You never disregard evidence that could be relevant for figuring out how well your hypothesis is supported and what actions to take on the basis of that. And that should never be done. And we know that people do it outside the scientific world. There are people who don't believe in climate change, and they disregard a good bit of the evidence in support of climate change, just looking at, year to year small changes, but not more global ones. And even more recently, in the present day and age, there are people who disregard the COVID situation with the virus and claim that, they don't have to worry about getting the virus if they go into big crowds and so forth. They don't take into account what the experts say, the evidence supplied by the experts. And that's a terrible thing. So I got to thinking, and people asked me, well, look, what's wrong with disregarding evidence? Why is it a no-no? The answer that's usually given is because there's a very fundamental scientific principle. It even has a name. It's called the requirement of total evidence, which says that when you formulate your theory, your hypothesis, your law, whatever it is you're formulating, you must consider all the evidence available to you, not just part of the evidence. You can't just cherry pick in this kind of situation, especially in science. You can't do it because that's irrational. And I wondered about that. Why is that so irrational? Why shouldn't we do it? And before I even asked that question or got to that question, the first question was, well, is it ever done in science? Can it ever be legitimate to do? And that's my question today. Can it ever be legitimate to do? And I'm going to give you 3 cases in which I will leave it to you to decide whether it's legitimate. I think it probably is, but we'll have to look at the cases. Each of these cases seems to violate this wonderful basic principle of requirement of total evidence. And the question is, do they really? And if they do violate it, what's wrong with that? Okay. So the 3 cases, the first is a sort of obvious one. It's not scientific. It's from the law. And think of a criminal trial, either a trial by jury or when the judge is alone at the bench issuing the verdict. Now suppose, we'll just stick with the jury trial. Suppose you, the juror, know some fact which is legally inadmissible. You learn of this fact. And the fact you learn is true, and it exonerates the defendant. All right? For example, it's the result of an illegal search. Suppose that is actually stated in court. That's inadmissible. The judge says it's inadmissible, but it's believable. Or suppose you have some information from a newspaper or a video about the crime, which is very believable and which shows that the defendant didn't do it. But the judge tells you as a juror to disregard that evidence. Give it no weight whatever. You've seen this thing on TV where the judge very sternly admonishes the jury, give it no weight whatever. And the courts, the standard instructions given to the jury, and this does vary to some extent, but there's a document, you can find it on the web, called the Court Standard Instructions to the Jury in a Criminal Case. And the standard instructions say, and I'm quoting, you must make your decision, whether guilty or not guilty, only on the admissible evidence presented here during the trial. Okay. But you, the juror, or the judge, you have some inadmissible evidence. You learned this, and you thoroughly believe that it's true. Okay, you are to disregard it in determining whether the defendant is guilty or not. That seems to be a violation of the principle of total evidence. You're not taking into account the total evidence. If you were, you would not convict the accused because you have this exonerating evidence, which let us assume for the sake of argument is pretty darn good. Okay. So what is the justification for this? I mean, what does the law say? Well, the law says different things, but the law gives you this idea of due process. You want to give the accused a fair trial, and you have to consider the rights of the defendant. And if the evidence was collected illegally by some, let's say, illegal police search, or if it's not presented in the court so everybody can hear it, or the other jurors and the judge can hear it, then the defendant is not being given a fair trial. And that is the justification for doing it. And of course, the court, as some people say, the court has to have the highest standards, whatever, in gathering and communicating evidence. And so this means this must be actually presented legally in court to the entire group. All right. So that is the justification. Okay. So what do you say about this? Is this a case where you have a genuine violation of this fundamental principle of evidence, fundamental principle of reasoning? Is this a violation or not? Well, one answer that's given is no, it's not a violation, because the disregarding evidence refers not to what you believe as a juror or a judge. It refers to the actions that you take. That is, you are to apply this rule of total evidence, not to, you can believe anything you want. All right. You can believe the defendant is innocent, but in deciding how to vote, if you're a juror, you have to disregard this legally inadmissible evidence. All right. And the, the so the people who want to defend the requirement of total evidence will say, well, in the law case, it applies not to what you believe, but to how you act. That is, the principle, you can believe whatever you want, you can accept the principle of total evidence, but in the law, you are legally justified in disregarding part of that evidence. Okay. Now, is that the way the law operates? Is that what the law tells you to do? Just worry about taking a vote, worry about how what you say in the end, how you act, and not worry about what you believe. And the problem with that is that the law doesn't say that. The law says that you are to disregard, not just in the case of the action you take as a juror, the voting you do as a juror, but you are to disregard in informing your belief of what vote to take. Here are the court's standard instructions to the jury. I'm going to read them to you. There are different states have different standard instructions, and different courts do, and so forth, but here's a typical one. The government must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? And if it fails to do so, you must find the defendant not guilty. So now it goes on. This is the crucial passage. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof so convincing that you would be willing to rely and act on it without hesitation in the most important of your own affairs. If you are convinced that the defendant has been proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, say so. If you are not convinced, say so. All right. Well, now we get to the heart of the matter. And of course, this idea of proof beyond a reasonable doubt is a very basic one and yet a controversial one. But whatever it is, it involves a belief. You've got to believe, and not just act on this. You've got to believe that the defendant has really been proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what the judge is telling you to do. That's what the law is telling you to do, okay? Before you can vote or take an action to convict. All right? But you don't believe that, right? Because you've got this exonerating evidence, which you thoroughly believe. Okay? So if you need to base your action of how to vote on a jury on what you believe, then you're in trouble, because disregarding the evidence will still not make you believe that the defendant is guilty. You believe the defendant is guilty because you have this exonerating evidence. So what at least the law requires is that you make a decision based on your belief. You can't get away with just saying just make a decision. Just the disregarding condition applies just to your action of voting. It applies to your belief as well. All right. So the second answer, that's one answer. It applies. Disregarding applies just to actions. The second answer is that I've heard this given sometimes, and that is that the judge's instructions should be understood hypothetically, or counterfactually. It says, if you were to disregard these inadmissible facts, would you then believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty? So you are to consider that hypothetical or counterfactual question. And that's a possible answer. That way you don't need to disregard anything. You just ask yourself, well, what if I did disregard, what would I think? Okay. The trouble with that is that that's not what the judge says. The judge The judge's instructions are categorical. The judge tells you, disregard this evidence, disregard these facts, okay? Give them no weight, whatever. And if you just base it on what you would do, we're often not very good predictors of what we would do if the situation were different. Because once we get into that actual situation, in many cases, we don't do what we say we would do. And so what the law is trying to tell you is, no, get yourself in a position such that you do disregard this evidence, and then, are you in a position to say, there is no reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Okay, so that hypothetical way out is not really very successful. It's not what actually happens. Let me mention a third one, because this beyond reasonable doubt, this kind of thing, and the disregarding rule are quite controversial even in the law. And what some people interested in law and the philosophy of law say is that the law should be changed. And it should be changed for two reasons, the law about inadmissible evidence. It should be changed because, psychologically speaking, it's very difficult to carry out. It's very difficult to disregard things that you've heard. One famous legal mind said, it's like unringing a bell. You can't do it, okay? And so the law should be changed in such a way as to recognize this, and so disregarding should not be made compulsory to do. Evidently, some people, some judges evidently are better at doing this than jurors are in general, and some jurors are better than other jurors at doing it, but even the best find it extremely difficult to do. It's an analogy might be with the religious scientist who, compartmentalizes. When he's doing science, this is evidence for, the Earth being as old as it is, and when he's practicing religion, then the hypothesis that is biblically confirmed is that the Earth is whatever it is, 6,000 or more years old, something like that. So you act in one context differently from the way you act in another context, and this is what the juror is supposed to do. Jurors are not very good at that. And the other objection to it is that the legal justification for disregarding is weak. It's an appeal to, the fairness of the trial, the fairness to the individual who is being tried, and it'll also be a good message to send to the police that we want our searches to be legal searches, not illegal ones. So these are the standard answers, standard justifications given. But there is one consideration that some writers on this topic emphasize more than anything else, and that's truth. They want the truth. You want to know whether that criminal really, the alleged criminal, the defendant, is really guilty. And in order to determine this, you have to consider all the evidence. In fact, many, many years ago, I was told that there were very few exclusionary rules in the way that there are now. And so this has changed over the years. Well, let me respond to these things. Let's suppose that it is very difficult to do, psychologically speaking, right? To disregard evidence that you have heard and you can't unring the bell. And let's suppose that the legal or moral justifications actually given for the disregarding rule are fairly weak, and they can be people who who stress more the truth of the matter would not buy into these other justifications as much as you would like. Let's suppose that all of that's true. So the law may need changing. But as it is now, the law says that the jury, in case of a jury trial, is to violate the requirement of total evidence. It is to disregard. And it gives these reasons, whether they're compelling reasons, whether you as a legal scholar or as a philosopher worried about these matters, whether you think that's a great justification or not, that's the law. Okay? And so in the law, you do have cases of disregarding evidence in such a way as to violate the requirement of total evidence, because you are then computing whether or considering whether the defendant is actually guilty on the basis of part of the evidence, not on the basis of all the evidence that you have. And that is a violation of the requirement of total evidence, or at least it seems to be. I put it to you as my audience, doesn't that seem that way to you? So I'm be curious if you stay for the question period to respond to that one, my first question to you. Okay, let me turn now to two scientific cases. I hope I have time for this. The first one is very famous. It comes from Isaac Newton. Okay, and as many of you know, Isaac Newton's most famous contribution was his law of gravity. And the law of gravity states that every physical body with mass attracts every other body in the universe with a force called the gravitational force, which varies as the product of the masses of these bodies, and it varies indirectly as a square of the distance between them. And this is supposed to hold at huge distances, all right? And it's supposed to explain why the planets revolve around the sun the way they do, and why our moon revolves around the earth the way it does, and so on. And that's exactly the way Newton proved it in 1687 in the first edition of his great work, the Principia. And he started with the known motions of the various planets and their moons, and it derived from this mathematically the full expression of the law that I just cited for you. Now, Newton was very sure that he had proved this law. And after the proof is all over, just at the very last 2 pages of the Principia, he turns to the following question. Why does this law hold? He says, look, the force that I am arriving at, this universal force of gravity, is so different from any other forces that I know about. Well, why is it different? Because, first of all, and most famously, it applies over immense distances. And where there seems to be nothing between the bodies, nothing between, let's say, the sun and the earth, or the sun and the other planets. So how can that be? There's no other force that we know of that acts like that. And this was the biggest worry that scientists of Newton's day had with Newton's law. The 2 most famous scientists were Leibniz and Huygens, who both rejected Newton's law as a physical law to explain the motions of the planets. Okay? But it's also a force that you can't block. No matter what goes on in between these bodies, there's going to be a force of attraction between the sun and us, or the other planets. And it penetrates to the inside of these bodies, to the center of these bodies. Okay, no matter how thick they are, right? It gets to the center of the earth. from the sun. All right. So Leibniz, who's primarily known as a philosopher, but of course co-invented the calculus along with Newton, and Huygens, who was a physicist, said that can't happen. There can be no action at a distance. And they reject Newton's law as Newton understood it, that is, as a force acting over empty space. It's a weird, it's a crazy, a very strange, spooky force. Galileo, before Newton, was thinking about gravity and said it made no sense to him. It's like, he was interested in the tides, and the question was whether the moon is responsible for the tides on the earth. And he said that's crazy because it would be like the earth, the moons so loved the earth that it attracted it, it attracted its waters periodically. This said Galileo, is not to be believed or even uttered. Okay. Now, Newton was aware of this, and this is one of the reasons he wrote the Principia the way he did and tried to prove the law step by step. And he himself was deeply worried about how and why gravity works the way it does. And he, at the end of the Principia, he mentions these facts about gravity and how different this force is from anything else, and how he has no answer to these questions of why gravity acts that way. And then he says famously in Latin, because that's the language in which he was writing the book, hypotheses non fingo, which means I don't make up or I don't frame hypotheses. I don't have an answer, and I'm not going to speculate. Okay. What Huygens and Leibniz were objecting to was a force sort of built into an innate force, like inertia is a force built into, according to Newton, built into matter. This tendency to move in a straight line if you're moving with uniform speed. So that's the way Leibniz and Huygens understood gravity, is just an innate tendency to be attracted and attract other bodies. And Newton said, that's nonsense. That's crazy. I can't believe that. The only possibility, that's why they're misquoting me. I never said that gravity was an innate force like inertia. The only possibility is if some agent, whether physical or non-physical, for example, God, transfers that force from one body to another. But Newton couldn't figure out what in the world could transfer that force. All right. So on a reasonable interpretation of Newton decided to disregard these funny properties of gravity, the fact that it could, action at a distance, the fact that it could penetrate to the interior of the body, and it couldn't be blocked. It presumably was instantaneous, didn't take time to travel. He disregards these in deriving his law. His line is, well, I just don't know the answer to these questions. I can't tell you how it works or why it works the way it does. And I can't get rid of these puzzling things. But I believe I have proved that it does work. So I'm going to disregard these very puzzling facts, which he knew were not just puzzling to him, but particularly to his opponents on the continent. I'm going to disregard those in computing how probable my law is, which is just what he did. He disregarded these puzzling facts and said, look, here is what I could do. I mean, he didn't say this. This is my rethinking of how Newton might have thought. He could have said, look, my law holds no matter how these puzzles are resolved. No future evidence will ever refute my law. Could have held that. So even if I just look at partial evidence, the partial evidence having to do with the motions of the planets, my law is proved, whatever happens in the future. Okay, he could have said that. That's one option. Or he could have said at the opposite end, he could have said, look, I'm going to withhold judgment. I don't know. I can't figure out how gravity works, why it works this way. This is a very strange thing. So I'm going to withhold judgment about whether my law is proved or not. That's another option. It's the third option I want to talk about. That's the disregarding option. What I think Newton did, or at least this is a possibility, and you could refute me if you think I'm wrong. What I think Newton did is say the following: I'm going to disregard these very puzzling facts about gravity until new evidence comes in and I can answer them. But until that evidence comes in, I am going to take completely into account the evidence that I do have, which is very strong indeed. Now, new evidence could topple the strength of the old evidence, that's for sure. And Newton agreed on that with regard to any theory that he was developing. New evidence could always destroy the efficacy of your old evidence. All right. But if he did this, and I think he did, if he said, look, I'm going to disregard these puzzling facts because I can't answer these questions. They may turn out to be very damaging to my theory, or they may not. I don't know. I'm going to disregard them for the moment and rely completely on the strength of my astronomical evidence for gravity, because that's what I have, and the astronomical evidence is really good. Okay. Now, I think he did not do the first thing. That is, he didn't say, I don't care what happens in the future with future evidence. I know my law is right, because that's not Newton. He was very sure of himself, but he wasn't that sure. Okay? He explicitly says, look, the only way you're going to refute me is to get some new evidence that goes against the present law. Okay? So he could not in principle say that he knows that his law is going to hold no matter what you find in future evidence. And he wouldn't have been Mr. Newton, what we was called the incomparable Mr. Newton, if he had gone to strategy number 2 and said, well, hey, I withhold my judgment here. You know, I got some strong evidence from astronomical observations, but I have some really puzzling facts about these properties of gravity. So I don't know what to do. I'll present them both, and I'm not sure where to go from here. I don't want to say that I've proved the law, or I don't want to say I haven't. There's some evidence here, some evidence there. So this is not Newton. Newton did not do that at all. What he said is, many times, I approve the law of gravity by astronomical evidence from the motions of the planets. Now, what's the justification for doing it? Why would he take that step? What could he say in his defense? Well, he could say in his defense, look, I'm advancing science. I am proposing a project for science, which is the project he indeed took up for a good part of his life. And that's figuring out why gravity works the way it does. Okay. That's a big issue. And of course, the scientists are still trying to figure out how to unite the force of gravity with the other 4 fundamental forces in nature. But in disregarding the evidence, the bad evidence, if you like, or the puzzling evidence, and promoting his law on the basis of the astronomical evidence, he is giving a much more freedom to pursuing this question, these troubling questions about why the law of gravity works the way it does, even though he is violating the requirement of total evidence. At least if you take that line, then I think you have to say he did violate the requirement of total evidence, and you have to listen to his justification for doing so, and then you have to decide if that justification is good enough. Did he do the right thing? And I think My answer would be, sure he did, pragmatically. Otherwise, we wouldn't, physics would not have advanced the way it did in the latter part of the 17th century. Okay. My third example comes from the beginning of the 20th century. And it involves the great physicist Ernest Rutherford, who at that time was working at Cambridge University. And he was working in the lab of J.J. Thomson at Cambridge and the Cavendish Laboratory. And some experiments had been done on atoms. This was a big issue. What are atoms like? You got to get yourself back to 1911. All right. And the question is, what are atoms like? And two experimentalists at that time, named Geiger and Marsden, had done experiments on gold atoms. They had a very thin sheet of gold, and they set up a system in which alpha particles, doubly ionized helium atoms, went right through the gold. And most of them went right through. But so very surprisingly, some bounced back. And these are, these are alpha particles, are pretty heavy particles from an atomic point of view. And so they probably weren't hitting the electrons in the atom. But since most of them went through the atom, but a few of them bounced back, the ones that bounced back were probably hitting a central charge part called the nucleus. Okay? And these experiments gave Rutherford the idea that an atom, and this was a revolutionary idea at the time, this had not been proposed, that the atom is like a solar system. And it's composed of a nucleus, which has a certain charge, and these electrons floating around in some way, which have the opposite charge, okay? And so he proposed that idea of the atom. And since an atom is stable, the electrons must be swirling around in some orbits or other. And there was a problem. And the problem was that if that's the right picture of the atom, then no atom could be stable. Okay, and you know that gold is pretty darn stable, right? Why not? Because if on the classical electrical theory, which Rutherford accepted, if you have accelerating electrons accelerating around something or other, they're going to lose energy and fall right into the nucleus that they are surrounding. That was the classical picture of a charged particle in motion. And so no atom could be stable. Okay, well, that can't be. We know that most atoms are stable. Okay, so what did Rutherford do? Rutherford explicitly says, look, I am going to put that problem of stability aside. I'm not going to worry about it for the moment because I can't solve it. I don't know yet. I am going to try to work out how these alpha particles are reacting with the gold atom in such a way as to make better predictions about what happens when you send them through, how many will be deflected at what angles and so on. I'm going to try to work out my model in this way. He was very sure that his model was right, even though he couldn't answer this fundamental question, or didn't put himself to try to answer that question. He put it aside. We might say he disregarded this very negative evidence, okay, in working out the model. But he was very sure, because he was always very sure of everything he said. He was very sure that the model was right. But he said, well, look, let's put it aside for another occasion. And luckily for him, the occasion came up 2 years later when he met the younger physicist Niels Bohr, who also came to the Cavendish lab. And Niels Bohr liked Rutherford's model and thought about it and said, well, I tell you what, let's give up classical electrical theory. And we'll just postulate that there are certain stable orbits of electrons. Right? And he worked out the first model, a quantum theory model of the atom. Niels Bohr did in 1913. But I want to get back to Rutherford, because I think Rutherford did just what Newton did. Rutherford was in a situation where he couldn't figure out how the atom could possibly be stable. And he said, I'm going to disregard this stability problem, and I am going to go with the experiments that I have, which suggest this kind of model, this solar model, the nucleus surrounded by rotating electrons model of the atom. And in doing this, he certainly violated the requirement of total evidence. Or at least I put it to you that this is a reasonable way to view what he did. And I think based on these factors of, look, we got to get on with science. We have to promote this. We have to promote these ideas and work on them. And if you just say, well, I give up, or I'm going to wait till I get more evidence, you won't get very far. Okay? And so I think that he was justified in doing what he did. Now let me end finally with an example, an ordinary example. There are many ordinary examples of this where I think it's quite legitimate. I'll mention a couple in the minute or two I have here. Look, journal editors these days insist that the reviewers of the articles review the articles blind. They cannot know who wrote the article or what university that person was from, okay? But sometimes that information is very relevant in deciding, or what lab that those experiments were made at, but very relevant in determining the worth of the article. And yet you are told by the journal editor to, even if you find out, and in many cases you can find out who wrote the article, in what lab, and what university, and so on, you are to disregard that. And that's thought to be a fair way of accepting journal articles, okay? And we do the same thing in college admissions. For certain disadvantaged candidates, we may disregard SAT scores or grades or whatever. But that are very relevant in determining how successful that candidate will be at the university. And that's considered a rational, reasonable thing to do. And the last example I'll mention is a battlefield example. Suppose you're a battlefield commander. And you don't know where the enemy positions are. You could radio your forward patrols to find out. You could get this evidence very easily, but you don't, because you don't want to break radio silence and give away your position. And so you disregard evidence you could easily get. So here's another situation. Now, in all these situations, it's what you're doing is restricting the evidence. You're not saying, well, I have some epistemic evidence. You're not saying that. You're saying, look, there are certain reasons, for certain non-evidential reasons, moral reasons, legal reasons, scientific reasons, whatever, for disregarding this evidence and looking at the rest of the evidence and making a judgment of how strongly to believe something on the basis of the rest of the evidence. And what I put it to you that this is sometimes a reasonable thing to do. It doesn't mean it's always a reasonable thing to do. It doesn't mean you should go out and deny, climate change and so on. You have to have a darn good reason for doing it, but sometimes you do, and sadly, sometimes you don't. And there's no generalizing about this. It's not as if you can say, well, always obey the rule of requirement of total evidence unless you have conditions A, B, and C. No, you can't generalize like that. You have to look at the conditions A, B, and C, the non-evidential conditions, and make a judgment. Are these conditions legitimate conditions on which to violate this fundamental sacred principle? But my point is, at least I'm going to put it to you, the audience, that indeed there are occasions, and I think I've given you a few, where it is a reasonable, rational thing to do. Okay, thank you. All right, let's see. We got some questions here. Oh my goodness sake. We have a technical question. Are there qualified elements to disregard Einstein's general theory of relativity, in particular his conception of space-time? Well, sure, in the sense of, look, if you're working out a problem that can be easily solved in Newtonian physics by assuming absolute space and time. In other words, if you're building a bridge, okay, you're not going to be concerned with Einsteinian general theory of relativity, nor will you be concerned with quantum mechanical events and so forth. So there are practical times when you disregard certain evidence. I think that's an obvious a point to make here. Whether I've sufficiently answered your question, I don't know. When an idea cannot be 100% proven true, does that necessarily mean it's false? No, it does not necessarily mean it's false at all. I mean, you know, I can't prove it's true or false. The probability is a half that this coin is going to land heads next time. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means that it has a probability of 1/2 of landing heads. Okay, does that answer that question? No. Look, Newton, for example, recognized that science is not pure mathematics. In pure mathematics, you can prove something, you know, beyond all possible doubt. Might have been his way of putting it. Whereas in empirical science, you can only prove something beyond reasonable doubt, to use the legal expression for science, which I'm not sure is the right thing to do. Now, there's a question as to what counts as reasonable. What counts as reasonable doubt, and what role does morality play in determining reasonable? Yeah, that's a good one. Because there used to be something called moral doubt or something like that. And the courts got rid of that expression in favor of the expression reasonable doubt. But then the question came up, and that's the one that is a puzzlement, as to what counts as reasonable doubt. And that the people who deal with these issues in the law, both philosophers and lawyers, worry about what counts as reasonable doubt. And there's a criticism of the expression that I quoted to you, that is, reasonable doubt is one that you would, would cause you, well, if you have no reasonable doubt, then you would act on it no matter what. Right? Well, that's the question. Sometimes you have no reasonable doubt, but it's still you don't want to act on it for whatever reason. Who knows? So it is a question as to what is meant by this notion of reasonable doubt. But one thing you don't want to get into is morality here. You want to distinguish morality from the law, even though in some sense the law encompasses morality. We have a legal system the way we do because of certain moral principles that we hold. Okay. Yes, what are your thoughts on the Senate disregarding evidence in the recent impeachment trial? Yes, my thoughts on that are the same as my thoughts on people who disregard COVID-19 and people who disregard climate change. It's bad, okay? And the reason that's given is just a political reason, because you want a certain outcome, and you know that if you admit this evidence in an impeachment trial, you're not going to get the outcome you want. That's a bad reason, okay? And then you have to go into why it's a bad reason and so forth. But sure, I'm not to be interpreted as saying any reason you give for disregarding is a good reason for you. No, it isn't. Okay. Disregarding climate change is a bad reason, even for you, if you disregard it, because it's going to create a climate that you can't live in. Okay. All right. What happens when a juror uses inadmissible evidence in one direction? For example, accept evidence to vote not, but ignore for a guilty vote. Yeah. What happens when a juror uses inadmissible evidence in one direction to accept evidence to vote not guilty, but ignore for guilty? Yes. That's a danger. And people want to do that, you know. The jury system, as its critics will point out, is very subjective. And what one person takes as a, beyond reasonable doubt, whatever that's supposed to mean, another person will say, no, there's a reasonable doubt there. And the question is, look, it's better, I think, in the law, it's better to let a guilty man go free than a not guilty man be incarcerated. So that may, that may form the basis for your own judgment. But look, even in science, there are many cases where there's a disagreement about the efficacy of the evidence. And there was in the case I gave you, though, one of the most famous cases in the history of science, Isaac Newton. His opponents, Huygens in particular, did not agree with Newton that the astronomical evidence proves Newton's law. That is, proves that there really is a physical force out there. Huygens said, okay, I'll give you that the law gives you good predictions, but I'm not going to give you that there's a force acting over a vast distance from the sun to the planets, producing the motions of the planets. That is not proved by your evidence. So again, even in one of the most famous cases in science, you have a disagreement about what the evidence itself shows, forgetting about the disregarding part of the evidence. You have a disagreement about what the evidence itself shows. So this is not just this does not just take place in the law; it takes place in sacred science as well. Please comment on on statistical significance. Well, it depends. Look, it depends what you're looking at. Are you looking at the law? Are you looking at science and which part of science and so on? When you're dealing with scientific problems in evidence, one of my favorite ones is in the late 19th century with the development of molecular theory. And the greatest 19th century physicist was James Clerk Maxwell, who from the 1860s to the late 1870s developed the kinetic theory of gases based on the idea that gases are composed of moving molecules and so on. And he had trouble getting a lot of evidence for that hypothesis. The evidence was well, both quantitative and qualitative, but he couldn't perform experiments on molecules. Okay, so what he had was a bunch of gas laws which suggested to him that they could be explained most easily and simply on the basis of the hypothesis that gases are composed of moving molecules which bounce against each other and against the size of the container. And he developed certain laws, and one of which was named after him, the Maxwell distribution law. Statistical significance did not come into the picture. Okay, it's not as if you can take a poll here and observe the individual molecules and make a generalization from individual molecules. Your evidence is not that kind of precise or quantitative. These are the kinds of cases, I think, that give philosophers of science and historians and scientists themselves the deepest concern. because what does count as evidence here? Did Maxwell have evidence for his kinetic theory, and when did evidence first come in? If he didn't, and only when you have much more quantitatively conducted experiments with lots of different numbers attached to them, do you worry about statistical significance, I think. Let's see. Can I discuss some hypotheses that have been disproven and why? Well, sure. Let's go back to the 19th century again, where you had big debates about the nature of light, okay? And stemming from the time of Newton, actually, in the 17th century, Newton versus, as I say, Huygens, one of his biggest competitors. Huygens, in the 17th century, said light is a wave motion in something called the ether. And Newton said, no, it isn't. It's a bunch of particles which come out of light objects. And this debate went well into the end of the 19th century, when two guys who actually came to Hopkins, when Kelvin came to Hopkins to give the lectures here in the late 19th century, Michelson and Morley discovered there was no ether. Okay, so the whole wave theory, as it was traditionally formulated, was proved wrong, and by that time, the particle theory of Newton was discredited. And it was lucky that the quantum theory was starting to come in the beginning of the 20th century. This is a case where it's an interesting case to mention, because most of the wave theorists disregarded the fact that no ether had ever been seen, okay? They based their evidence on the wave theory of light on the fact that the wave theory could explain a lot of the known phenomena of light. And if you had said to them, but where's the ether? They would have said, hey, that's another problem. Let's disregard that until we can figure it out. And then Michelson and Morley come along and figure out there ain't none. There's very good scientific evidence on the basis of their experiments with light to conclude there is no ether. So sure, you disregard it when it's doing so well. You hope that somebody will solve the problem, but you hope that somebody will solve the problem in a way that doesn't disprove your theory. But that's exactly what happened in the case of the wave theory. So it can go either way, okay? It can go either way. When you disregard, you take a risk, but you may be disregarding for good reasons. You may be disregarding for terrible reasons. You have to look at the reasons. And if you are disregarding, you take the risk of being proved wrong, as did the wave theorists in the 19th century. Well, we're coming to an end, so I will leave you with this question as to whether you are a staunch believer in the requirement of total evidence or not. I have come to believe, as a result of thinking about this more recently, this has been worrying me for the last 6 months or so, that there may well be cases where it's quite legitimate, both in science and in the law and in ordinary dealings, to disregard evidence. You've got to be pretty sure that you've got good reasons to do so, because the initial position, I think, is right. That is, other things equal, you should really take into account all the evidence. So your reason for not doing this, your reason for disregarding, ought to be a very good one. But there's no magic pill to decide what those reasons should be. Okay, I want to thank you all for listening, and those of you who raised questions for doing so. I've enjoyed being here, and I hope you will tune in to the next one, whenever that is. Okay, thank you.